Top 10 Amazing Facts About Ancient Rome. 1. The Romans carefully guarded fortune books. The Romans always kept away from prying eyes books written in Greek that spoke of the future of Rome and its citizens, including the inevitable collapse of the empire. These manuscripts were kept in the Temple of Jupiter, and only the most qualified interpreters were allowed access to them, trying to determine what was going to happen and how best to prevent it. Legend has it that one day an old woman approached King Tarquinius the Proud, at a time when Rome was still ruled by Etruscan kings. She offered him 9 books at an absurdly huge price, so the king refused. The old woman burned 3 books and then offered to buy the remaining 6 at the same price. Tarquinius refused again, but this time he began to question what he was rejecting. The old woman left and burned 3 more books. When she returned with the last 3, the king bought them. After studying the ancient manuscripts, it became apparent that they were books of prophecy, for they told of the inevitable rise and fall of Rome. From that day on, the books of the Sibyls were kept secret and carefully guarded, and were only taken out when Rome was in danger and needed answers. 2. Crassus' fire brigade was the most corrupt fire department. Rome's first triumvirate consisted of 3 very powerful men: Gaius Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompeius, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus, who was essentially in the shadow of Caesar and Pompey, is not usually talked about in most history textbooks. He was a true misanthrope whose avarice and lack of humanity were legendary. One little-known story about Crassus concerns his fire department. It would seem that what was wrong with creating a unit to put out fires that were a huge threat to Rome, which was full of wooden buildings. There is one little but. The fire brigade would arrive on the scene and did nothing until the owner of the blazing house sold his property to Crassus for pennies on the dollar. Only then would the house begin to be extinguished. 3. Publicans were the mafia of ancient Rome. Tax collector has always been a thankless profession. But tax collectors today are far more benevolent and loyal than their ancient counterparts. In the 2nd century BC, Roman businessmen who took property from the state were called publicans. Arriving in newly conquered provinces, they engaged in taxation, which they levied on the locals. As can be easily guessed, they usually squeezed out as much money as they could from the poor people. The wealth accumulated by the publicans led them to control trade, banking, and shipping. The publicans collected a decum tax, 10% of the harvest, much of which went to the Roman government. Since some of this wealth ended up in the pockets of Roman politicians, almost any actions of the publicans were silently condemned but tolerated. 4. The man who infiltrated a festival exclusively for women. In December, ancient Rome celebrated the festival of the good goddess. Women gathered together to hold rituals dedicated to the goddess, and men were strictly forbidden to participate in this festival. Even statues of men had to be covered with veils during it. This, however, did not prevent Publius Clodius Pulchris from disguising himself as a girl flutist or harpist, according to some accounts, and infiltrating the sacred festival. When he was unmasked, the case almost ended in execution for insulting the goddess of chastity. The offender survived only thanks to his patrons, who had bribed the judges and the Senate. 5. King Mithridates grew up in the wilderness and was immune to poison. Although he was not actually a Roman, King Mithridates VI of Pontus played a tremendous role in Roman history. He was one of the greatest threats to the Roman state, comparable to Hannibal of Carthage. As a child, Mithridates was persecuted by his mother. Forced to take refuge in the forest, he lived there for 7 years, where he constantly fought wild beasts and ate venison. During this time, the future king constantly took sublethal doses of poisons until he developed immunity to them. Unfortunately, this led to an unpleasant mishap when the king attempted to be captured by rebels. Mithridates drank the poison to avoid capture, but it had no effect. Fortunately, there was a bodyguard nearby, whom he asked to kill him with his sword. 6. Sergius Orata invented the thermal baths. As today, many wealthy townspeople in the ancient world vacationed in resorts, one of the most popular of which was Pozzuoli. They were quick to buy up accommodations in this town, so that their vacation would not be marred by poor people. The resourceful businessman Sergius Orata was known for selling the most delicious oysters on this side of the Rubicon. However, he was also known for a popular invention called balnei pensiles. Some claim it was a hot shower, while others believe it was an underfloor heating system. 7. The Emperor Caligula appointed his horse a member of the Senate. According to historian Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Emperor Caligula so adored his stallion Cincinnatus that he appointed him a member of the Senate. Some think this was a sign of insanity. Other scholars argue that it was done to insult and humiliate the senators and the elite. Caligula's relatively brief reign was characterized by animosity between him and the Roman Senate and the emperor's efforts to consolidate his power in the empire. By entrusting high public office to his horse, Caligula made it clear to his subordinates that their work was so meaningless that even an animal could do it. 8. The Romans worshipped the gods of excrement. Sterculus was the Roman god of manure and fertilizer. But this is not the strangest member of the local pantheon. The Romans also prayed to Cloacina, goddess of sewers, as well as Crepitus, god of toilets. Cloacina was the patron goddess of the main drain of the city of Rome, which was known as the Cloaca Maxima. Subsequently, the Romans began to venerate Cloacina in various ways: goddess of purity, goddess of filth, and protector of sexual intercourse in marriage. Over the centuries she was associated with Venus, the goddess of beauty and love, and gradually Cloacina became known to many as the Venetian Cloacina. 9. A group of women were accused of mass murder by poisoning. The theme of poisons and poisoning is often touched upon in Roman literature. Apparently, poisoning was much more common in antiquity than in modern times. The first known ancient Roman record concerning this type of crime claims a large number of deaths. Although this was probably caused by an epidemic, it was specifically related to poisoning. After many citizens had died of the same ailment, a slave woman informed the Cureletals, official magistrates, that the sudden upsurge in deaths was caused by poisons made by Roman matrons. 20 matrons, including even patrician women, were accused of putting poison in beer that they thought was useful. The authorities proved their guilt very simply by making the women drink their own brew. In the end, they all died from their own beer. Who these women were, and what their motive was, no one will ever know. 10. Rome was ruled by a transsexual emperor. Although Emperor Elagabalus is known to historians, most people have never heard of him. Not surprisingly, most history textbooks avoid this topic, because it involves an emperor who was transsexual. The theme of Elagabalus' genitals appears frequently in many of his stories. Sources claim that Elagabalus was circumcised, as required by the priestly profession. There are claims that his penis was infibulated. According to the Roman historian and statesman Dion Cassius, Elagabalus wanted to be castrated, but not at all for religion. In fact, according to Cassius, it was for the sake of womanhood. Many historians today interpret this to mean that the young emperor was transsexual. Although initially supported by the Roman army, Elagabalus was despised by influential senators. Eventually, Elagabalus was killed and his mutilated corpse dragged through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber.